Excellencies, colleagues, I am pleased to present this statement on behalf of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago at this critical COP. At the outset, let me say that Trinidad and Tobago, or COP25, is vitally important for three key reasons. Firstly, we absolutely must make progress in shifting the world onto 1.5C warning trajectory. Globally, we are already experiencing dangerous climate impacts with a current level of warming at 1.1C. In Trinidad and Tobago, unprecedented rain over the past few months has caused human suffering and damage to infrastructure and property. Secondly, this must be an implementation COP. Even while we enhance our ambition, it is important that we shift into transformational implementation. We must move beyond pledges to action. Trinidad and Tobago is undertaking widespread policy reform to support implementation of the Paris Agreement. Step by step, we are creating the architecture that will guide us towards a just and equitable transition to a low-carbon development pathway. At this time, we are ramping up support for adaptation to protect vulnerable people and ecosystems on the front lines. Thirdly, this COP must send a clear signal to people everywhere, especially the youth whose futures are at stake, that as international community, we are committed to the course we set out in Paris. This is not a time for lowering expectation or for lowest common denominator agreements. COP27 must deliver on the just demand from vulnerable countries for financing arrangements on loss and damage. Mr. President, Trinidad and Tobago remains committed to making progress on the climate change agenda. Indeed, as requested by the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Honorable Prime Minister, Dr. Keith Rowley, committed to a further enhancement of renewable energy capacity to 30% by 2030 as he addressed the Leaders' Summit at COP26 in Glasgow last year. I am pleased to say that this will form the basis of our revised NDC, and the national approval process is expected to be completed shortly. This would allow the submission of Trinidad and Tobago's revised NDC before the end of this year. Trinidad and Tobago is on the verge of tripling its renewable energy capacity by 2030 following the installation of 112 megawatts of utility-scale solar power, the largest in the Caribbean. As a small island developing state with an oil, gas, and petrochemical-based economy, the challenge to transition to low-carbon development will be significant. However, Trinidad and Tobago understands that the transition is an imperative more than a choice, and we are determined to meet that challenge head-on. We are creating the legislative, policy, administrative, and enabling environment to incentivize private sector investment in low-carbon technology. I am pleased to highlight that we are progressing on the establishment of a green hydrogen facility fully financed by the private sector. Moreover, at the national level, we have developed inter alia a national climate policy to guide climate action, which is now being updated to include the provisions of the Paris Agreement and the decisions taken regarding implementation of those provisions, as the national climate agenda is guided by international climate policy. A carbon reduction strategy from which the nationally determined contribution under the Paris Agreement was derived, and a long-term strategy for reducing greenhouse gas emissions to 2050. Detailed inventories of greenhouse gas emissions and identified intervention measures to reduce these emissions. A financial measurement, reporting, and verification system for greenhouse gas emissions being managed by the Environment Management Authority. I hope to take a cabinet note to soon formalize this system into a legislative framework to make greenhouse gas reporting and mitigation actions mandatory, and I expect to get the relevant technical drafting instructions from the EMA soon to set this in motion. A just transition of workforce policy to address issues not only related to retooling, reschooling, and reskilling the workforce in preparation for the inevitable energy transition, but to also address the displacement of livelihoods affected by the impacts of climate change. A national adaptation plan which details strategies and actions in relevant vulnerable sectors to increase resiliency and integrate climate change in the national development process. A draft e-mobility policy to catalyze the penetration of electric vehicles in the transportation mix. The finalization of the policy is currently underway after conducting some analysis to determine technical barriers and ways to overcome them. Importantly, we have also conducted gender studies in order to assess how these issues are to be considered and integrated into climate action plans, and we have carried out studies on vulnerability to climate change, including a capacity assessment for climate risks. Finally, plans are also well underway to developing a net zero plan for a second half of this country. Mr. President, a lot has been done, but we admit that we need to go further. We cannot do this alone. We count on the support of the international community to help us to further our national implementation efforts to tackle the climate crisis. In particular, we would welcome proposals from an international platform to assist countries in their just transition planning. We think that such a platform would be a useful forum for sharing experiences and lessons learned on these critical activities. I thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency.